Hello, woman beings, and welcome to another episode of the Woman Being Podcast. I am very, very excited about today's episode. I'm joined by my lovely co-hosts, Emma and Kellyanne. Say hello.
Hello.
And we're also joined by Erica Smith, who is an award-winning sexuality educator and consultant with over 20 years of experience. And she's here to talk to us today about porn. So
Dun, dun, dun.
This is a topic we have been wanting to dive into for a long time, and she is here today to talk to us. Say hello, Erica.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me.
We're so excited to have you, and we will talk a little bit more about Erica and about the things that she has to talk to us about in a minute. This is Woman Being,
where we explore thoughts and opinions
and have the freedom to change our minds.
Without expectation or judgment,
we will hold a safe space and support each other
as we navigate together in the form of feminine.
So once again, Erica is with us today. We're very excited. A little bit more about her. She has provided comprehensive sex education and advocacy to young women and LGBTQ plus youth in Philadelphia's juvenile justice system, worked in abortion care, and supported HIV and transgender adolescents and their families. In 2019, she developed the Purity Culture Dropout Program to help people learn all of the sex education that they missed growing up in purity culture. Sex ed that is accurate, queer inclusive, trauma-informed, compassionate, and comprehensive. So, Erica, so glad to have you today. But to start us off, I wondered if to get us all on the same page, you could just simply define what we're talking about when we mean porn. What does porn mean?
So this is a great question because the question in and of itself doesn't have a agreed upon answer by most people. Porn is one of those things that is kind of in the eye of the beholder. There are folks that would and do consider a women's underwear magazine like the Victoria's Secret catalog to be porn. There are other folks who say, oh, that's ridiculous. Porn has to involve graphic depictions of sexual acts. So the sort of, there was a famous Supreme Court case, I think in the 1960s, and a Supreme Court justice said about the definition of obscenity. I can't really describe it to you, but I know it when I see it. And I think for a lot of people, that's how they feel about porn. But the definition that I rely on is one that a scholar who, I forget exactly what they study, but someone came up with this definition, and it's any kind of material depicting sex or sex acts that is intentionally meant to subvert societal and cultural norms. So that would mean that just a painting of a naked person done in the Renaissance era isn't necessarily porn, but when it's purposefully created to be subversive and kind of goes against the moral code that society at large is holding, then it can be considered pornography. So that in and of itself, I think, teaches us a lot about porn because it's very often up to the individual for interpretation.
Totally. Thank you so much for defining that. I think it's helpful before we dive into any of the rest of this conversation that at least between the four of us and our listeners, we have a common understanding of what we're talking about. Everybody is entitled to their own sort of, adjustment to that definition, but our definition refers to what you just said. So
cool.
So for everyone who's listening, I took a class, one of your classes on porn for Purity Culture Dropouts, and it was mind-blowing. Full disclosure to everybody, I have the most limited exposure to porn that you could ever possibly imagine. I don't think I've ever purposefully consumed porn in my life. And so I'm coming to this conversation today with that perspective in mind. I think there's probably plenty of people listening who probably have the same experience, and there's probably others who understand porn well.
Yeah,
far from what I do. So a wide spectrum of perspectives is represented here. But just loved your class because it opened up my mind to porn not as a horrible, evil, awful, terrible thing wholly and completely. But with that in mind, there are some disclaimers that we probably want to make before we really get into the conversation, which is just what we aren't saying when it comes to pornography. So you had several slides in your class that I took that sort of talked about like setting the stage for people. So will you dive into that as well?
Yeah, sure. So the reason that I decided to teach a class about pornography, especially one that was geared towards people that had been raised with the idea that all of it was horrible across the board, is because I wanted to give people more sides to the story than just what you would hear from the church or from anti-porn campaigns, which are all linked to religion. So I wanted to give people history, like an overview of the scientific research done around porn, and also a look at the industry from someone who works inside of it. And the goal was to help people kind of navigate how they feel about it, to navigate conversations about it, to figure out how to be discerning about what kinds of pornography are more ethical to consume. And basically, I wanted people to be able to make up their own minds. But I'm very clear when I teach this class and when I talk about porn in general, I'm not trying to make anyone enjoy it. I'm not trying to make everyone watch it. I'm not in denial that porn can be harmful to people or used in harmful ways. It would be a lie if I was like, porn's great, I want everyone to get into it. It's like, no, that's not my agenda. I just really want us to be able to think critically about the topic and make up our own minds.
Totally. That's super helpful. I think for a lot of people, because, I think the prevailing narrative in culture, not just even in religious settings, is that porn is bad. Like Pornhub's been under a lot of fire lately. There's a lot of press against certain things. And the idea here is we're not trying to say porn is great, everybody should do it. There are definite like cons. There's some like harmful things that have been attributed to porn, but there's also like a lot of unnecessary harm that's been attributed to porn, and not all of it is inherently wrong. So that's kind of what we're diving into today. So
Erica, I'm curious to know, I come from the quintessential perfect purity culture background. And so I'm really interested to know what really pushed you in that direction to study the influence of purity culture on the topic of porn. I'm always curious, a lot of people don't even know what purity culture is. When I'm talking to people in the wild, now that I've deconstructed
in the wild,
they're just like, what is that? So what drew you to that, and how did you kind of get started?
I was drawn to the topic, not because I was raised in it. I'm always very clear that it's not my personal experience. So I grew up in a household that was not overly religious. We didn't go to church all the time. And I was not taught that sex was harmful or bad or something that I absolutely needed to save until marriage. So I grew up with a more relaxed attitude about sex, but I started noticing pretty early on in my work that sexuality was such a difficult topic for so many people, and that the church, and when I say the church, what I'm specifically talking about is the white evangelical church in America and its influence in politics and its influence in decision-making that has to do with sexuality, abortion, sex education, the funding that is given to abstinence-only programming. I was watching all this happen and seeing this doesn't actually help people. It is quite harmful. Yeah. When I worked in abortion care, that's kind of when my eyes were really open to how much misinformation was being given to people about sex and sexuality. And so all through my career, when I was doing work in things like HIV care and HIV prevention and abortion care, I felt like the religious right was my constant opponent. They were just there at every turn to block people's access and to, create an environment where sex was a terrifying prospect for people. And it gave so many people baggage around it. So when I decided to address purity culture as part of my work, I feel like it had been a very long time coming. And I was able to see clearly that the people raised with this idea, you all had no choice. I wouldn't say like you're part of the problem, like you were raised in it and you don't have any alternative perspective. So when folks started coming out of purity culture and saying, hey, that was actually really bad for me, and it gave me these issues around sex, and it gave me all this misinformation, it made me feel terrible, I saw such an opportunity to create work that was specifically addressing those issues. So that's how I got involved. I feel like it was a long time coming because the religious right and their anti-sexuality stance was always something I was like pushing up against in my work.
And I mean, honestly, no pun intended, thank God that you ended up in this space, because I mean, I can't tell you the amount of both men and women that I have had conversations with. I mean, post ministry school, even in ministry school, that it was like, whoa, like, how do we actually have a balanced perspective on this? Because it's very, my experience was very disassociated from what the real world actually is and what real people are actually going through. And so I love that you can bring that humanity perspective to it.
Thank you.
Of course. Yeah. So pushing back just a little further, what is your background as a sex educator and how did you end up there? Because that feels like people seem to have a very specific calling to sex education. One of my best friends is now becoming a sex educator, and it's not for the faint of heart. So how'd you get there?
I think that giving a little context about the time and place that I was a young woman is important. So I'm now in my 40s. And so I was a teenager in the 1990s. And I was always a feminist from my earliest memory, not because someone told me that, not because I was raised to be that way, just because I remember just seeing injustice around me and being mad about it, even when I was like 11 years old. So I always had an interest in like women's stories and women's experiences. And I was from a very young age, super pissed about like sexism and misogyny. And that was like my whole identity as a teenager. I was like angry feminist riot girl in the 1990s. And
excellent.
When it came time to go to college, there was nothing else I wanted to do other than major in women's studies. And I went to Penn State University, and they had a women's studies, which is now called like women, gender, and sexuality studies. I think a lot of programs have kind of gotten more modern and changed their name to be like gender studies. But back at this time, it was women's studies. And so I majored in that. I got very involved in like feminist activism, and a lot of the stuff that my friends and I were doing activist work around were sexuality issues, like sexual assault on campus and consent and, exploitation of women and queer stuff. And that's where I really felt passionate about. And so a lot of the classes that I took, I loved the classes the most that focused on things like women's health and wellness and sexuality. And so by the time I graduated, that was the stuff I cared the most about. I cared about sex education. I cared about having access to reproductive health care, about people knowing how their bodies worked. And so it's a thing that I just sort of naturally gravitated toward. There was no sex education modeled for me as like a job. So, when I was a kid, I wasn't like, I want to be a sex educator. I knew I wanted to be some sort of counselor, some sort of person that helped women. But sex education is something I just sort of created my own path in. And my first job out of college was working in an abortion clinic where I was a counselor and an advocate. I would, talk to people about their procedures and give them all the education on them, and then even be in the room with them to help them through the procedure and hold their hand and talk to them. And that was my like first paying sex ed job, I think. And that was kind of the beginning of everything for me.
Wow. First of all, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Like, you are the woman and like women like you who paved the way for so many women like us who are now entering kind of that space. And not that we're becoming sex educators, but because of people like you, there is so much more research and access to information and all of the things that, I mean, like I think we've spent the last several years together and separately sort of discovering so much that we didn't learn about our sexuality and about our bodies and who we are as women, and consent. Like all of those things are so vital and important and amazing. So,
and never, I feel like it's been a wild 2 decades to be involved in this work, because in some ways we are so far advanced from 20 years ago. But then in other ways, we just talked about Roe v. Wade being overturned before we started recording. So there's some things that it's like, there's still such a need for for people doing this work.
Absolutely.
For sure.
Yeah. It's like 2 steps forward, 1 step back over and over again.
That's what it feels like a lot of the time.
I actually, even when you're describing what your job was, your first job out of college, I actually had like an emotional reaction. Like I teared up, like, wow, thank you. Again, like I mean, we're all saying thank you, but thank you for the work that you've done. And it actually makes me curious. I have another question in my lineup, but I want to like interrupt it with like another question. And it's, what surprised you the most going through first your education and into fields like, abortion care and like being an activist, like what has surprised you going through that process?
I love this question. And the first thing that comes to mind is that almost everyone, regardless of race, gender, class, socioeconomic status, has the same questions and insecurities about sex. So the work that I do with and these are examples of different people I've worked with, the same skills that I would use to talk to a 13-year-old Black trans girl in jail are the same skills that I use to talk to a 50-year-old mom of 5 who is like white and upper middle class and like from Texas.
Wow.
People all want to know the same stuff. They want to know, am I normal? Is it normal what my body's doing? Are the thoughts and feelings I have normal? And everyone just, everyone, no matter who they are, if they have been denied information about their bodies and about sex, suffer greatly from it. So it's like, when I left the work that I had been doing for years with youth in detention, I remember thinking, well, nothing I ever do is going to feel as meaningful as working with like, queer teenagers in jail. But that's absolutely not true, because the kind of like service I provide and the kind of like stuff I help people with is still really life-changing, even if the person I'm working with has like so much more privilege in other ways than the kids in detention. Like you can be a princess in a castle, and if you don't know shit about sex, it's going to mess up your life. You know what I mean? Like, so that's the thing that I think is something I had to learn over the years is like, some women who might appear to have it all are really, really struggling because of the lack of basic knowledge, information, and like permission to just be themselves when it comes to sexuality. So yeah, that's kind of a long answer, but I hope I was clear. I hope that it makes sense.
That's great. Yeah. I want to kind of steer the conversation back to porn. I wondered actually, I mean, in line with everyone kind of shares these same insecurities, these same questions. I think the same is true for porn, right? Like we all kind of, I mean, some people have more or less access or experience with this realm, but there's also kind of prevailing narratives that are talking about porn in a very negative light. Could you touch on that and like why the porn conversation is so negative as far like not just in religious circles, but in the secular world as well, and kind of just how that narrative has become the prevailing narrative?
What's interesting here is that it would be very hard to separate like the religious narrative from the secular narrative, because the religious narrative is what has completely influenced the secular narrative. So you kind of have to take it back some decades. Like we're going back like, gosh, the 1960s were so long ago. Like that's like 60 years ago, which is wild. So back then there was more there were changes in technology that allowed movies to be made, and easily reproducible movies. And then when the 1980s happened and VCRs and like home video cameras came out, there was really an explosion of pornographic content available. Before then, there had always been things like magazines and novels and literature and photos.
Mm-hmm.
But it was in the 1960s that activists around obscenity, who were always based in like Christian organizations, started campaigns to make pornography go away. And their big argument was like, well, it's just morally wrong. But that didn't have a lot of success, that their movement did not really pick up. The movement didn't gain a lot of traction. They were not able to be a strong opponent of pornography. So there was a conscious decision to rebrand as organizations that cared about public health and as organizations that were very worried about human trafficking. And so another disclaimer here, human trafficking is absolutely a real issue. I've worked with victims of trafficking. I'm not saying it isn't. But what I'm pointing out is that people that were rallying against obscenity were like, yeah, we don't have, it's not something that's really getting people behind us. So let's say that porn is a public health issue. So if you've ever heard someone say that porn is a public health issue, that's not been decided upon by public health experts. That was decided upon by religious advocates and anti-obscenity crusaders. So they have changed their message to be more in line with what they see as like the social justice cares of the day. How can we make young people get behind this anti-porn thing? We're going to say that it's a social justice issue, a public health issue, and then it's very disrespectful of women, as if they care about gender equality.
Yeah.
Anyway.
Or respecting women.
Right. But this message has really taken on, it's become very popular. And so it's easier to get people behind you and it's easier to export that message. So when I was putting this class together, one of the things I noticed is that I would find mainstream news sources like Men's Health Magazine or Psychology Today. And you would think that, a place like that isn't going to be deeply influenced by religion. But if I started looking at like who's actually speaking as an expert in this Men's Health article, and I would Google them and follow all the way back to their like resume and CV. And very often, almost every single time, they were people that were deeply linked to religious anti-porn movements. So it's become a message that's easier to spread among the general public because the general public doesn't realize that it is a conservative religious message because it's been cloaked in this like healthcare and social justice concern.
So setting the stage for that, everyone, the prevailing narrative about porn in our country is a conservative Christian or religious viewpoint.
Yeah.
So that's just helpful to know.
One of the main organizations that was called Morality in Media, they like intentionally like hired some big conservative think tank to rebrand them as something that sounds like way cooler, So if you believed this narrative and if you've just been like, well, yeah, I heard porn ruins your brain and that it's addicting and that it literally changes your brain, these talking points can all be traced back to conservative organizations whose overarching large agenda is for us to only experience sexuality in the confines of a Christian heterosexual marriage. And I don't know about you, but I don't trust those organizations to teach me about sex when I know that the only sexuality they approve of is monogamous heterosexual marriage. So I certainly don't trust them to teach me about porn. And that's where these voices are originating, from people whose true only belief that sexuality is okay happens in a straight monogamous marriage.
So, Erica, really getting to what we're all here today to talk about, how has the concept of porn addiction come to the forefront of conversation about porn? Like, where did that come from? And what does the actual research say about porn addiction? Because I feel like from a conservative Christian perspective, this is like porn addiction is rampant and everyone should be concerned. I can't tell you how many church services I've sat through and they're like, however many percentage of whatever men are watching porn right now. And it's like, oh my gosh, and it's something people really fret about. So
yeah,
what is the root of all this?
So there are several things going on here. And this is another time where I would say that as a disclaimer, I am not asserting that porn can't be used in problematic ways and that people can't experience compulsive behavior around it and that it can't wreak havoc in relationships.
Absolutely.
And, that's something that is indisputable.
Mm-hmm.
But I think it's interesting to look at, like you asked, where does this idea come from that it's an addiction? So a few things are happening at once. One is the way people use technology now. So it's absolutely true that porn is so much more easily accessible than it was decades ago.
Mm-hmm.
So again, let's go back to the 90s when I was a teenager. If you wanted to see porn, you had to rent a VHS tape or you had to find someone's brother's VHS tape or find a Playboy magazine in the woods. It wasn't a thing, and that's exactly how people saw porn for the first time. Would be like, oh my God, I found my brother's magazine. Or I had someone I know who's dad had a collection of VHS tapes. You would find someone else's porn. You could not just access it the way we can instantly now. So the proliferation of technology and the internet and our phones, which are cameras, and, we can access every movie ever made at any time. So that has given us so much more access to porn, which is where a lot of concern comes from naturally. And it's absolutely true that, millions of people are able to access porn every day. And I know I have some statistics about that in in the class I teach. And one of them that I can just read to you right now is 2019, Pornhub says it had 42 billion individual visitors, averaging more than 115 million visits per day. So this is statistics that comes from Pornhub itself. They keep very careful measurements of their numbers. And so that's saying that it's really easy to access. So this, of course, is a reason for concern. But the narrative about it being a addiction is very interesting. The people that say porn is an addiction, by and large, are affiliated with religious-based anti-porn campaigns. So if you've ever heard of Porn Kills Love or Fight the New Drug, they don't sound like religious campaigns, right? It's not the same as saying this is morality in media, which is an old name for an anti-porn organization. They're making it sound very divorced from religion. And if you look up Fight the New Drug, they insist that they're non-religiously affiliated. They say it's science, it's just the facts, but it's all run and founded by members of the Mormon Church. And the director of research is a professor of marriage and family studies at Brigham Young University. And his main research interest is how porn threatens marriage. So he's one of the bigwigs behind the Porn Kills Love movement. And these are the folks that will tell you it's the fact that pornography is addictive. And there's actual sex researchers who are people who are trained researchers who have done studies of the brain that truly show that someone who self-describes as a porn addict, if they are exposed to pornography, their brain does not light up in the same way that an addict who was addicted to drugs or alcohol would experience when exposed to the substance of their addiction. So another thing it's important to mention is that if you tell people over and over and over that they can become addicted to porn, they are more likely to self-identify as porn addicts. And they're more likely to self-identify as porn addicts if they were raised with a lot of religious shame. So if you would ask, for example, a man who was brought up evangelical Christian and looks at porn once a month, he might identify as a porn addict. In fact, I once worked with someone who said his wife and his pastor called him an addict and sent him to a porn addiction recovery program because he looked at it 4 or 5 times a year. And, Yes. And
Not
this
exactly
is,
addiction.
Yeah, I'm
Right.
like, if you have 4 or 5 drinks a year,
Yeah, I was thinking,
you're not an alcoholic.
if you have 4 or 5 drinks a month, you're not an alcoholic.
Yeah.
right.
But
Right.
watching
But
porn once, yeah.
So the research from sexuality researchers and sexologists shows that you were more likely to self-describe as a porn addict if you were given all this messaging about porn. But the research from like neuroscientists also shows that you're not actually experiencing an addiction in the clinical sense. So if we want to actually help the people that feel like we're using porn too much, viewing it through an addictions model isn't going to be helpful. And a bad thing, a lot of things are bad here, but I want you to think of like a cycle that keeps itself going. So we're saying porn is addicting, porn is addicting, porn is addicting. Oh, you feel like an addict because I've been telling you porn is addicting? Well, I'm selling an anti-porn addiction rehab program that's related to my church. And you're going to come there and we're going to keep layering the shame on so you feel worse and worse. And it's a cycle. So some of the people that have found that porn isn't addicting have been harassed and had to move and change their, like their work locations or their own homes because of how much they get targeted for releasing research that says porn is not an addiction.
Wow.
One thing that I want to read this directly verbatim from my class.
Yeah.
The scholarship around porn addiction is complicated by misunderstandings about addiction, combined with religious anxiety and financial motivation. In the U.S., sex researchers have been targeted, harassed, and doxxed. Some have left the country. Their findings often directly contradict the assertion of anti-porn campaigns and for-profit porn addiction, in quotes, rehabs. Yeah.
It comes back to money.
It does. So since porn has become so easy to access, there's been a lot of attention paid to the subject of porn and addiction and a huge growth in residential treatment facilities who offer recovery programs for those who self-identify as porn addicts or whose partners say they're porn addicts.
Wow.
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 It makes me so curious to know how many of those programs are out there. Because I can't, any church on any corner is very likely to have a men's support group, right?
Oh, yeah.
And they will all swear up and down that it's the best program and it's not like anything else. But I'm like, come on.
Another thing, and you can do this yourself if you haven't already, if you would Google porn addiction, all of the Google first and second page results are recovery centers that have to do with religion. They have names like Husband Haven. And that's they're dominating the conversation and the SEO results. So it would be so easy if you were a person that's like, I feel kind of bad about how often I'm jerking off to porn. And you Google because you want to read about it. And what you're finding is a faith-based program that's like, oh yeah, dude, you are such an addict. You were disgusting.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Dang.
and I'm curious what the success rates of those places even is. Like,
they're terrible. It's like a diet. You know how diets have such little long-term success rates?
Right.
If you're telling people that like you're still giving them the message that sexuality is really bad.
Yeah.
And there is no actual official diagnosis of porn addiction in the DSM. In 2019, the World Health Organization created a diagnosis called compulsive sexual behavior disorder, but that's an impulse control disorder, which is different than an addiction. Can I read you a couple more things that I feel like it's important to know?
Absolutely.
Teach us.
About porn rehab facilities. So many U.S. treatment centers with porn and sex addiction programs are either explicitly religious or have a strong religious bent. Their websites are full of misinformation, like pornography is as addictive as alcohol, drugs, or gambling. And the website will be like, this is a proven fact, but there's zero citation. There's one website or one program, the doctor who runs it also argues that homosexuality is threatening to inundate the nation. So these are people that aren't, they're not the people you want to get your like sex and porn info from.
Right.
Yeah.
And there is actual research about some program that has been helpful to pornography, people who feel like they're using porn compulsively. And it's not about treating them like they're addicts. It's something that's called acceptance and commitment therapy. So it seeks to reduce how much people view it over time. So if you tell men, and it's all, the research is always done on men, like if you tell men, like, it's not actually that bad to watch porn. It doesn't mean you're ruining your life. It doesn't mean you're sinning. It doesn't mean that you're the most disgusting human being on the planet. If you give them that anti-shaming message, it actually reduces how much they want to watch it. I liken it to, you know, once again, I compare it to food. Like if someone's trying not to binge eat, sheer willpower, it's going to make them binge eat the shit out of food the next time they see it. But if you tell people like, yeah, it's totally okay to eat that chocolate cake and it's not forbidden and it's not actually that bad, that can really change the person's relationship to the substance or to the thing.
Yeah.
Wow. And so it's almost like anti-shame therapy. It's like,
For
like
sure.
compulsive behavior seems to be maybe even linked to that kind of shame message.
For sure.
And not an addictive, not because porn is an addictive substance. That's fascinating.
Yeah. I mean, it's almost like evangelicals create the problem by creating a shame mindset around it.
1,000%.
But we are here to save the world.
And a thing about like the reason why so much of society has just accepted this stuff as fact is because we just exist in a deeply sex negative society, and we have a lot of fears and distrust of sexuality. So if someone that seems like they have a bit of authority, like the church, is telling us this is so bad, this is an addiction, porn is bad, it's always going to ruin you, it's not that hard for the average person to be like, sounds right, you know?
Well, I wanted to touch on something you brought up, though, too, which is the fact that so many of these studies have been done on men and not women. And I remember I grew up, and the first time I ever met a girl who admitted that she, like, viewed porn or consumed porn, I was, like, floored. Because what I had been taught was that women don't have that problem. They're not visual like men. They don't have the temptation of porn or pretty much anything. Like they're just not going to fall into sexual sin in the same way men are, which is why women have to, you know, dress modestly and take extra precautions because men have these impulses that they can't control.
For sure. And
this girl, she came out and said, I consume porn and I don't know how to stop. And I remember just being horrified. I was like, that's... I honestly, I look back on my reaction internally and I feel so ashamed of it because I was like flabbergasted. I was disgusted. I was like, you must be on another level.
Just just totally twisted.
Yeah,
and
he's
vile
like, something
somehow.
awful must have happened to you for you to consume porn. But I mean, thankfully I've grown. I feel so awful about that. But thankfully the understanding I've come to is that there are lots of women all over the place who view porn all the time.
Tons of women.
Yes. And so I wondered if you want to touch on that. I don't know if you've come across this in your work of women who feel alone in viewing porn or feel like they're the only ones. Have you come across that?
Yeah, the same thing that you're sharing is that, you know, women often who were raised in purity culture were taught that like women don't even masturbate. That's a men's problem. That's a men's battle. And so I've worked with women who said they didn't even realize women could masturbate until they were 20 years old because it was always just so drilled into them that like, you know, men struggle with this, men watch porn. So yeah, I've for sure heard that before. The feeling that like I was a weirdo, I was an outlier because I enjoy, you know, watching pornography or I enjoy looking at photos of naked, sexy people. When in reality, like our brains are hardwired to find, you know, to find sexual images arousing. It all like evolutionary biologists will say that all of this is just part of us perpetuating the species. We get turned on by fantasies. We get turned on by porn. It makes us more likely to actually have sexual intercourse, which makes us more likely to reproduce. Like we're, at the end of the day, we're animals, just like any other creature. But a, lot of women do watch porn. And that's something that I think I like that we're pushing back on the taboo of that. The Pornhub statistics from 2019. And again, I'm not saying, I'm not promoting Pornhub by sharing their statistics, but they do keep really good information about who's consuming. And approximately 32% of their audience is female, which that's a lot. That's a lot of people. And so folks there's long been a movement to create the kind of pornographic content that women are going to be more likely to want to see, the kind that actually focuses on the pleasure of a woman and not just penis-centric through the male view.
Yeah, I remember, so I discovered porn before I was even a Christian. So that was like part of my life before Christianity even was. And I remember, I think I talked about this in our sexuality episode, which you could go back and listen to, folks. I think that's like season 1 or 2.
Yeah.
But I remember like telling a bunch of leaders in my church when I was in high school, like, I used to watch porn. Like I think I probably even described it as a porn addiction because that was the language I was given. And I wanted to tell people about it because I was like, other women must be struggling with this too. Like, or other women must have experienced this. And I wanted them to feel like they weren't, weird or that they weren't like totally crazy. Even though I was still thinking of it from like a sin framework, it was like, so many women came to me afterwards who were younger than me, women who like I had no idea would have even interacted with it and were like, and essentially like admitted that they had also consumed porn and had felt so much shame around it. And I think that's so important to talk about how like women also will want to watch porn, or women also will masturbate or will have a sexual desire at all. I'm curious if you have any like guesses as to why it is that women are kept out of the conversation when it comes to porn consumption. I feel like women are illustrated as victims when it comes to pornography, but not ever as consumers or even advocates.
Yeah. And that all, I mean, going way, way, way to the top, that's the patriarchal view of what women's role is when it comes to sex, that we are the passive people who give sex to men, that we are the objects of desire, that we are there to look pretty and give blowjobs. So it's the fact that like women's own pleasure is so disregarded is key to this conversation, because people don't want to think of women as getting horny and masturbating or having their own needs and desires that are perfectly fine to have. And, I will often talk to clients about like, it's been a long time, or it's not that long ago that even seeing a woman masturbating or getting oral sex in a movie was something you would never see.
Oh, for sure.
And we're seeing it more and more, which I absolutely love. Like, before I got on our call today, I was watching season 2 of The Sex Lives of College Girls, which is a fantastic show. If you want to see like women being unapologetically into sex and like seeking out pleasure. But a show like that would have been so taboo. Even like, I don't know, I'm thinking of like when I was in college, Sex in the City premiered, and it was like, oh my God, I can't believe there's an episode where Charlotte buys a rabbit vibrator. And I can't believe that Samantha like masturbates all afternoon. Like that was crazy. People talked about that show like, oh my God. So we're not used to seeing our pleasure front and center. And so that's part of why I think a lot of people don't even consider that women might be very active consumers of porn.
Right.
Totally.
Yeah. I mean, I think to take that even a step further, I don't know that women, or at least growing up in purity culture, I did not feel that I had ownership of my own body.
Yeah.
And so when I realized at 19 years old that I could masturbate, like the feeling of like, oh my gosh, like I'm in my body, but outside of my body. And I think so many people are struggling with that. Like it feels like sinful to have ownership over your body.
Yeah.
Which speaks back to what you were saying about that patriarchal perspective and that really that control of bodies. You mentioned earlier, like we were talking about Roe v. Wade and all those things, like what's it going to take for women to be able to own their own sexuality and their own body? I don't know.
Well, and I mean, if you feel that you have no self-identity, how can you possibly advocate for yourself?
Yeah.
How can you possibly like give ownership and like feel authority over your body? You can't. And so that way the church gets to tell you what your identity is.
Yeah.
That way like big conservative leaders get to say you're this and you don't really get a say.
Yeah.
Yep.
So it all comes back to power and control.
And if you've been, raised that way since childhood, it's so easy to control people.
Yeah.
Totally. And so then again, harping back on the idea of women and their involvement in pornography, there is this idea that's proliferated about sex trafficking, which you've mentioned, being linked with pornography. So I'm curious just where the root of that is and what the actual hard facts are around that, if we even know them. Like what is the link, if any, to sex trafficking and pornography as we know it?
There's one organization in particular that I think it's important to spotlight when it comes to the conversation, including sex trafficking. And that is a group called Exodus Cry. They are actually linked to a church called International House of Prayer, which if you are, raised evangelical, you may be familiar with. But International House of Prayer is a very, very conservative evangelical church in Kansas. And they define sexual immorality as all sexual activity outside of the marriage covenant between one man and one woman. And so they realized that they weren't getting a lot of people signing on to their mission. So they altered their mission statement to remove all references to Jesus, all references to prayer. And even though they were an organization that wants strict Christian purity, their mission is now we are against trafficking. But they make no distinction between victims of non-consensual, like people who are actually forced into the sex trade and people who choose to be sex workers of their own volition. And so they've connected the conversation between porn and sex trafficking, because truly, who can say that they're pro sex trafficking? Nobody. I mean, unless you're a pimp, right?
Yeah.
We are not pimps in this recording today.
Yeah.
That I'm aware of.
Definitely not.
We are not pro sex trafficking. So it's hard to argue and be like, oh, this anti-trafficking organization sounds shady. It's like, oh, this sounds like a noble mission.
Yeah.
But they will tell you at Exodus Cry that you have to eradicate porn in order to eradicate trafficking. So they take an issue that is absolutely a real issue, people being forced into sexual slavery, and say that porn is fundamental to trafficking, and we have to get rid of porn to save people. I think that pinpointing Exodus Cry in particular is important in this conversation, but they are absolutely criticized by people who are sex working advocates and people who have been sexually exploited, because the people will tell you, well, Exodus Cry didn't want to listen to me. They just wanted to paint me as a victim. So this is really where that link comes from.
So then, truly, do we know how much actual sex trafficking is linked to porn? Like, do we have an understanding of that outside of like a Christian affiliated organization like Exodus Cry?
I don't think there is. I have not come across a clear statistic. It is so difficult to study these sorts of things.
Yeah.
So this is where I'm always like, what do actual sex workers have to say? What do people who are actually like sex worker advocates and activists have to say? And they will tell you that organizations like Exodus Cry and other like super religious based anti-trafficking organizations have created policies that actually defund AIDS programs, that create policies that actually defund abortion access. They reject listening to sex workers. They peddle the victim narrative for everybody involved. It's very difficult to actually find the statistic though of like how much porn creation is of trafficking.
Yeah.
But I want to can I read you another quote that I think is really important?
Please
Absolutely.
do.
This is a quote from a investigative reporter for Vice magazine. Her name is Samantha Cole. Sex trafficking is a real and tragic issue, but anti-trafficking groups frequently equate the entire adult industry, including porn, with exploitation and paint sex workers as victims in need of rescue. Anti-sex trafficking is a topic that's easy to gain political backing, fundraising, and popular support for. By couching the conversation as being against sexual slavery, which who wouldn't be against that, right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
It's easy to shut down the more nuanced and difficult conversations about the ways that politicians, businesses, antiquated laws, poorly written sex trafficking legislation, and an anti-sex work culture have more broadly hurt and killed people who are working in the consensual porn and sex work industries.
Sure.
No reasonable human is pro-trafficking, but anti-trafficking groups use the issue to advance legislations and policies and real-world stigma against sex workers to further their cause. Frequently, these anti-sex trafficking groups just want to end the entire adult industry altogether.
Mhm.
So,
Right.
you know, if you tell them, well, hey, I'm against sex trafficking too, but I am a sex worker that has my own OnlyFans. Nobody is trafficking me. They're not going to be like, cool, good for you, girl. You know what I mean?
Right. Yeah. Because I mean, essentially, I think as far as I understand it, the argument is that demand drives the production.
Right.
Demand drives production. And so, I mean, this version of production is you find
Mm-hmm.
people to traffic in order to meet demand.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, that does not account for people who are operating within a consensual operation. And one of the most amazing things about your class that I took, which I can't recommend this class enough, do it again. Anybody listening, follow Erica and check and see when her next workshop is going to be, because you don't want to miss it.
It's also, you can purchase the recording. So if you didn't see the class live, like anybody can purchase the recording of me teaching the class.
Excellent.
Do that.
Everyone go buy it.
Seriously, like so fascinating. But you had a porn star actually come to the class, and she talked extensively about like the levels of consent and scrutiny that the porn industry is under, and how specific they have to be about contact tracing and like forms and like all of the little things that they have to do to make sure that everybody is as safe as possible in a very, I guess, sort of like tenuous type of industry. They have to be extra careful. And so it's like, you're almost going to find better consent having sex in front of a camera in the porn industry than you are like in a marriage.
You totally are.
You know?
I mean, and like, you know, so her name is Siri, and that, you know, that's the name she goes by. And she will tell you that like, she has always felt like very respected doing her work, more so than when she was like a server at a restaurant. And when you are in the industry as she is, and you know, not all porn is produced by major theater, or I'm sorry, major production companies, of course, but she does work for the big production companies. And she shared how they have like written consent agreements. You have to like sit down and negotiate everything you're willing or unwilling to do beforehand. And there's also like very, very rigorous like STI testing and reporting. So she'll tell you like, yeah, it feels safer to me to like do a scene with somebody than it would be to like pick up someone at a bar and like just have sex with them. And
so obviously, yeah, like you said, that is not the same across the board. Like there, as we have said many times, there are varying levels of, I guess, positivity within the sex industry. But yeah, I was shocked at like how specific they are and how like
For
committed
sure.
to safety they are, because they have to be, which is great. That's a good thing.
Yeah. I think that having her perspective is so important, because we do always hear about the people working in the industry, especially the women, as victims. And, they're there because they had a terrible life, or they're there because they think that they're worthless, or they're there because they were sexually abused as children. And she will tell you, like, that is such a, like, just an untrue narrative for many people that do this work, including her. And so I thought it was great to have the perspective of someone who's like, I'm not a victim. Like, I love my job.
It sounds to me like it's probably hard to even quantify like the correlation between sex trafficking and pornography, considering that it's an underground business, like how do you count that? How do you really even like put a number onto that, or find ways to provide data when it really is a hidden industry, but it's also not the entire industry. And I think that's a really important thing to hone in on here, is that there is so much consensual sex work that's happening. There's so many people that choose to be within this industry. And I think that for some people that sounds so foreign, or so just like out of their realm of understanding of like what someone would choose to do. But I think that this is about building like empathy and understanding for people choosing to a career path that they want. Like, that's what it is at the end of the day.
And honestly, like, I'm glad you shared that. I think that it's something that especially if you were raised to view like anyone doing sex work as a victim, or as like a person just devoid of any moral compass, to listen to the people that actually have chosen this work and hear what they say about their experience, rather than just painting them all with this broad brush that they need to be rescued. One of my favorite quotes to think about sex work is from the psychologist, Dr. Eric Sprankel. And he says that, like, if you think that sex workers sell their bodies, but like coal miners don't, then your view of labor is clouded by your moralistic view of sex.
Yeah.
And that's like, that was something that I remember even having to like think hard about when I was younger, like, because there is such a stigma on sex work, and it can be really hard to get rid of that idea that like, oh, everyone who does it is just a terrible person, or they're just a person I don't want to associate with, and be like, no, this is a job and it's work. And there are many, many ways that people can be exploited by each other. And sexual exploitation is just the tip of the iceberg. I mean, you want to talk about like multinational corporations and how they exploit people?
Absolutely.
That's not a conversation that comes up very much when we're talking about consensual sex work. People are like, oh no, it's exploitation. I'm like, then I hope you're ready to talk about everything else that is exploitation.
Absolutely. Talk about our trade relationship with China. Like, let's talk about that, like, if you want to talk about exploitation. But
totally. So, Erica, I think you've hinted at this a little bit throughout the conversation. Feminist porn. So could you speak to what feminist porn is, what that even means, and like what it looks like to have what people are calling ethical porn now, or that there's this whole movement around pornography of more quote unquote ethical porn, more feminist porn, more woman focused porn, or like oriented towards a female audience. Could you speak to that some?
Of course. So the idea that women wanted to create their own porn and create porn that was kind of through the view of women it has a long history. I'm thinking back to like some of the creators in the 1970s, like Annie Sprinkle. If you want to look up any of these fascinating women, you absolutely should. Annie Sprinkle, Carol Queen, Candida Royale, Nina Hartley. They were like early pioneers of creating porn that like women would want to look at because it was focused on the pleasure of a woman. So, there's actual scenes of women being pleasured. It's not just focused on like a close up of a penis moving in and out of somebody. And the idea of what makes porn feminist is, of course, going to be defined differently by different people, but producing it in a way that is like supportive and taking like the worker's comfort into account is a huge part of it. But there's the idea of like the content itself. There are some folks that would say porn is considered ethical or feminist if it doesn't show like, you know, like a power dynamic or, you know, some taboo topics like incest, or if it doesn't show like somebody like, you know, having rough sex with another person. But the other side of that argument is, well, if I like that stuff and it's created ethically and with the consent of all involved, then why isn't that feminist porn too?
Mm-hmm.
So there's some nuance to the topic, but there's a growing number of websites and resources about pornography that is created by more than just a male for a male.
Totally.
So we're talking about queer porn and feminist porn. Sometimes that's an overlap, sometimes it's not. But there's a, you know, I feel like if we're talking about feminist porn, queer porn also needs to be mentioned because it is often more focused on things like racial diversity, gender diversity, showing different body types, kink friendly. So yeah, there's a lot of stuff out there now that is kind of being produced by people that wouldn't have had, you know, the chance to be at the table before.
And is there like a formula to finding ethical porn or feminist porn, or like how does one discern what like the source that they're consuming?
Yeah, this is a great question because I think, you know, people like when they hear the term ethical porn, they're like, okay, that's cool. How do I actually find something that feels like I can support it? And the easiest way to do that, and like this is the cheat sheet version, is to pay for the pornography you're consuming.
Yep.
Also, like finding ethical porn is about understanding how to buy the stuff, buy from companies whose business practices you support. So I think that it's most often done well when you purchase it directly from the source or performer. So go to the production company, learn who they are, learn, you know, who's in charge of it, and buy right from that company. Don't go to like Pornhub where it's like going to be up there for free. Go to, if you like a particular performer, they often will sell clips or photos or their own videos, or they might have an OnlyFans, or they probably have a Twitter where they can tell you how to buy the content directly from them. That is a wonderful way to support porn creators is buying it directly from the person who is in it. So it like takes away the middleman or the multiple middlemen. I want to also just mention for a moment, like the word ethical can definitely mean different things to different people. And there's not like a standard across the industry. Like if you do this, this, and this, your porn is considered, quote, ethical. That can be subjective to viewers and performers. And I've heard folks in the industry, including the woman who was in the webinar with me, she said that dividing all porn into categories of ethical and unethical, it can actually be a little bit harmful because it creates an unfair dichotomy within porn. So most of the stuff that is like anything coming from a major theater is going to be produced in ways that is like respecting performers and paying them well and good working conditions. But if you're like, well, I only think it's ethical if X, Y, and Z, then you're kind of ignoring, or the false dichotomy can be hurtful to people.
It's interesting to talk about and to think about in terms of like, I think in general, our culture I think it is, but hopefully more and more becoming more and more conscious of their consumerism and what companies we're going to buy from. And so
for sure,
in the same sense that you really want to consider like, where is this t-shirt coming from? And like, what business am I supporting and who's really getting paid for this? I think the same applies to porn.
It does. And I actually use that metaphor myself. Like I compare it to purchasing clothing, because if I want something quick, cheap, that looks relatively good. Like I can go buy clothing at H&M or Walmart or Target or somewhere that's mass-produced garments. It's going to get the job done. It's going to look decent, but I don't know who made that, like I don't know if someone working 16 hours a day in a factory with only one break made my shirt.
Yeah.
But if I'm buying from like a local someone that hand makes clothing locally, and you can like actually see the person who created that and know that it's been created with good working conditions, you're going to pay more, but it also is going to be higher quality. You're going to know that it was done in a way that you feel good about. So that's, it's similar to porn. Like you have to be willing to pay for it to really know that what you're looking at is going to make you feel like you're an ethical consumer and the person you're buying from isn't exploited.
Totally. Yeah. Well, and it sounds to me like these organizations that are anti-porn, their solutions like, preventing access to HIV care or birth control or abortion care, those things actually cause more harm within the porn industry. But taking the time to be an ethical consumer of porn is going to perpetuate a more ethical, quote unquote, overall porn industry. You're promoting what you believe in. You're voting with your dollar, as they say. And I think that sounds like a way more effective solution to any sort of abuses that could be happening within the porn industry, as opposed to what these other organizations put forward as their solutions.
100%. Yeah.
So, Erica, I just want to circle back to what you said earlier. You were talking about feminist porn and kink and ethical porn versus non-ethical, which I really like what Siri had to say about that. But what are your thoughts on things like more kink, like consensual non-consent? Like how, things start to get very gray as far as ethical versus non-ethical. And if you're serving a variety of sexual desires and inclusion within the porn industry, how do you navigate those things?
Oh, this is a complicated question. And there's, no denying that plenty of people fantasize about situations of non-consent, either being the perpetrator or the person experiencing the non-consensual act. That is a common sexual fantasy. It's even, it's a common fantasy for women. And the theory behind it, this is fascinating to me, but the theory behind why so many women might fantasize about being sexually assaulted is, for some people, it makes it feel safer to want sex if you imagine yourself as the person who, it just happened to me.
Wow.
Isn't that wild?
Yeah.
It's kind of mind blowing. But it is a very real thing that people enjoy power dynamics in sex. It's what makes sex really hot to some people. The more taboo something is, the more likely that someone out there is going to find it titillating and arousing.
Yeah.
And so, if we do create pornography that caters to this content and to this fantasy for people, this is something that I think that we could ponder the ethics of for a very long time. But the truth is there's a lot of desire for this kind of content. And if it's being created by people who are willingly participating in it, then they are, it's acting and it's fantasy.
Right.
I don't think that removing all sexual content that depicts non-consensual sex or depicts assault would eradicate or, make people less likely to be assaulted. But I mean, there is a demand for this content. And if it is, even people who are BDSM practitioners, there's often dynamics where one person is, topping or inflicting pain or discomfort on another person. But all of that is done with deep consent of both parties. So I think it is important to remember that this material, if it's being created, is created by actors who are fully consenting to the dynamic that they are showing on screen, that they could actually stop at any time. And that is the same for if you're practicing this kind of like kink or power dynamics in real life, that you and your partner are both fully consenting and that you can stop at any time. So yeah, it's not a simple thing. It's not like easy. You know, I couldn't just say, well, we shouldn't create this content, or people shouldn't want to experience this, because I mean, truly it's a fantasy for a lot of people. I don't even think that it's necessarily something we have to interrogate or get rid of if it's your fantasy.
Sure.
But acting it out in a way that you are in control, you are safe, or, you know, creating content about it in a way that you are in control and you are safe is the most important thing.
Yeah, for sure. And I think what you said is key. Like, this is acting, right? Like, I think our generation tends to forget, like, a lot of what you see on YouTube or TikTok or even movies, like, it's acting. Like, I remember having a conversation with someone about the most recent Elvis movie. It was like, wow, I didn't know all these things. I'm like, well, that's not a documentary.
Yeah.
Like, you know, like, and I think that realization of like, these people are pretending and that's okay.
Yeah.
I get to participate in the pretending, but once it's done, realizing this was pretend.
Yes.
And that doesn't mean it's not valid and it's not good.
Of course. And you just really like highlighted a key to porn literacy, which means like consuming it with a critical mind that is knowing that what you're watching is acting and they are performing. And while a lot of the stuff, you know, it's easy to blur those lines with, you know, social media and documentaries and everything, but you're watching people who are doing it knowing a camera is there. And so it's not going to be the way that we always have sex in real life. It's not going to be the way that we can always expect sex to be in real life. So watching it with the knowledge that like these folks are entertaining me is very important.
Yeah, and Siri brought that up in your class as well. She's like, hey, you're not going to be able to accomplish some of the things that some of these people are able to accomplish. Right, and like having that literacy is super important.
Yeah, like think of it as pro athletes. You don't watch the Olympics and think, oh my gosh, I can totally do this like back handspring triple thing just because someone else does it. Like the people that are like the big porn stars, they treat their bodies the way a professional athlete would treat their bodies. They do stuff that we aren't capable of, and we should be able to recognize that.
Yeah, it's like those girls have dilators on lockdown. Like, don't touch that. It's all good.
Yep, there is preparation that goes into scenes, and they are doing it in, you know, the way that someone at the top of their game, at the top of their profession does.
Yeah.
And the average person, you know, isn't going to be able to achieve some of the like levels of sexual feats just because you decide that that's what you want to do that day.
Right. For sure. That's really good.
But yeah, I wanted to circle back too, though, to this idea of like eradicating kink or like thinking that like, oh, if we stop like creating porn that is like X, then people will stop wanting it. Or like we'll just remove that, I don't know, corner of sexual immorality from our repertoire. And I think it's super unrealistic. And even that extends to ending porn ends sex trafficking, or ending porn ends unethical treatment of people. I mean, I think it's similar to abortion. Like if you want less abortions in our country, then support things like ending stigmas for women who are pregnant or people who are pregnant, and creating opportunities for people to access birth control, or increase sex education, or create more more funding and help to people who get pregnant. Like all of those factors are ways that would encourage more people to go through their pregnancy rather than choose to end it. And rather than trying to eradicate something that you disagree with, trying to create a more ethical society that removes shame and like control on people so that they can make informed decisions that are beneficial, I think is actually a better way to go about it.
And giving people like safe outlets through which to like express those fantasies.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
I mean, history will show you that fantasizing about power dynamics is not a new thing. It
Totally.
is a tale as old as time. Some of the earliest pornographic writings were deeply kinky, and I'm talking like hundreds of years ago. So like, we didn't invent this shit. You know what I mean?
Oh yeah.
Totally.
It's phenomenal. I mean, when you start, looking at things like Kama Sutra, or even like on ancient Egyptian walls, there's depictions of women pleasuring themselves with like a pointy rock. And it's just like, wow. It's truly throughout our history. It's woven throughout our history.
It absolutely is. I mean, the idea that sexual immorality is a new thing is hilarious to me. I'm like, how do you think our species perpetuates? Because people are horny and they want to do something about it.
Yeah.
That's good. People are horny and they want to do something about it.
You know what?
Human nature.
And I think that's wonderful.
And that's it. And I think, it's all a part of like trying to, I think you mentioned the United States as a whole is a very sex negative culture, and more programs that promote sex positivity or sex neutrality even are good and healthy and would, I think, end so many of the more harmful things, or at least greatly reduce some of the more harmful things that are happening behind closed doors.
Absolutely.
But Erica, this has been a wonderful conversation. I was so excited for this episode, and here we are. We're doing it. It was amazing.
Yay. Thank you.
Very excited for people to check out your seminar and also just to listen to this one in general. But I have one final question for you, which is a question we ask all of our guests, which is, what does woman being mean to you?
So I feel like I'm going to have to ask you a question in response. Like,
sure.
When I hear the phrase, I'm like, is being used as a noun or an action?
It's been interpreted both ways.
Yeah.
It depends. Some people think of it as an activity, and some people think of it as a state.
I mean, it's such a good question, because you've really got me like pondering which direction to take this. For me, I will say, like, I am a cis woman. I'm a cisgender woman, meaning my gender identity has always remained consistent with the sex I was assigned at birth. And I know sometimes people are like, I don't feel that connected to being a woman, but I absolutely do. For me, it is a core part of my identity, and I'm a queer woman, and I feel very content and secure in my identity as a woman. And it is a big part of who I am and how I see the world. So that's my answer.
I love that. I think honestly, you gave me chills, because I think it's so rare for people to come out and talk about like being content in womanhood. I think we hear a lot of like, I mean, there is a lot of struggle, right? There's a lot of pushing against the grain and like not really fitting into our patriarchal norms and things like that I think are involved in womanhood. But I think the reality of just accepting and enjoying and feeling confident in womanhood, in whatever form that takes, I think is really beautiful.
Yes, and there are a million ways to be a woman. Sometimes I speak to people that are like, well, I'm just really uncomfortable with the whole idea. And I'm like, well, what does it mean to you to be a woman? And I think that it can be very expansive.
Yeah.
It is for me.
Yeah. And that's so great. That's so beautiful. Well, lastly, are there any, other than your porn seminar that everyone's definitely going to check out, are there any other resources that you would like to suggest for people who are listening to this episode who are either coming up out of purity culture, who are in purity culture, or I mean, I suppose some of us maybe even haven't been that entrenched in the way that a lot of us are, but what resources do you have?
Depending on when this episode airs, if it airs before the end of 2022, it's a perfect time to purchase any of my classes for a discount. I'm selling everything right now for $15 a class. So that includes the porn class, a class that is geared towards people who have not had sex for the first time, a class about sexual communication, a class about casual sex and dating, and also just like a basic sex ed 101 class. So I'm selling all of those, the recordings of all of those on my website, in addition to a sexual values workbook that is a workbook that allows you to kind of think critically about all kinds of different aspects of sexuality and come up with your own personal values on it. And I am also in the process of creating a class for parents who are raised in purity culture and want to be able to educate their own children about sex. So,
beautiful.
That class, but it's specifically like a class for people who don't want to pass the sexual shame on to the next generation.
Right. Yeah, I saw one of your Instagram posts about that. Very excited. Not a parent, but very excited.
So needed as well.
Yeah, so needed. That's amazing. Well, thank you so much again for being here. I know I've said that like 70 times, but it really is such an honor to have you. I feel like I've learned so much from you, from your Instagram. People definitely. What's your Instagram handle?
It's ericasmith.sex.ed, and my name is spelled with a C, Erica.
Yeah. So check out her Instagram, give her a follow. You are putting so much amazing content out there, and people can kind of stay with you and see what other stuff you kind of come out with. And while you're doing that, also check out our Instagram at Woman Being Podcast, or TikTok. We have a thriving, small but thriving and growing community on TikTok that has been such a joy to communicate with and go back and forth with. And you can check us out on any podcast platform. You can check out our website. We have a blog now on womanbeingcommunity.com. And thank you everyone for listening today. And with that, without further ado, we'll say goodbye for today.
We'll catch you next time.
Bye.